as I've said, welcome to our briefing. We'd like to start with just a short prayer. Please join me. As we celebrate the UN Treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons coming into force, we pray that this treaty will indeed help to see an end to all nuclear weapons in the future. Help us to better understand the issues connected with weapons of mass destruction and to help others to do so as well. For this we pray in the name of Jesus. Amen. Now, I'd like to also share with you two other very brief slides. The first is one I'm sure many of you are well familiar with. Oh no, this one you may not be. This is a resolution from the 1998 Anglican Lambeth Conference, and it was passed overwhelmingly. This conference resolves to call upon our respective governments, and through our respective governments, the United Nations and other instruments, to urge all nations to agree by treaty to stop the production, testing, stockpiling, and usage of nuclear weapons, and to press for an international mandate for all member states to prohibit nuclear warfare. I think that resolution is what we are seeing come into fact today by the work of hundreds of thousands of people around the world. And finally, this is the quote: "Now is the time to affirm not only the immorality of the use of nuclear weapons, but the immorality of their possession." So I now Russell Whiting from Christian CND take us through the rest of this brief.
Thank you, Sue. Welcome again, everyone, on behalf of Christian CND. The world that we live in at the moment is an incredibly volatile and dangerous place. Last week, Donald Trump had his finger taken off the tweet button, but his finger remains on the nuclear button for the next 8 days. And even then, we have to ask ourselves whether we're any happier for Joe Biden to have his finger on the button than Donald Trump to have his finger on it. The nuclear threat in the past 10 years has been elevated by the collapse of the Iran nuclear deal and the development of nuclear weapons by North Korea. However, there is good news on the horizon. In just 9 days' time, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons will enter into force, and nuclear weapons will be banned in the same way as chemical and biological weapons have been banned since. Today, we're very privileged and blessed to be joined by Rebecca Johnson, who is one of the founder members of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, and one of the architects of the treaty, and also Steve Hucklesby from the Methodist Church Joint Public Issues team. And they're both going to be talking to us about different aspects of the treaty. And then we'll have plenty of time after that for some questions and answers, and any comments you have for us on how we can be taking this campaigning forward. And I'll tell you a bit more about the other events that the NCPO are doing in the run up to the 22nd of January. But for now, Rebecca, I'll hand over to you for your presentation. Thank you. You're just on mute, Rebecca, sorry.
Sorry, thank you very much, Russell. And just while I set up to my slideshow so that I can actually give you something clear to be looking at while I speak, I want to thank the Anglican Pacifist Fellowship and also Christian CND, of course, for organizing this briefing and the one on Thursday. I think it's just really so important that we are able to inform each other and share ideas about what we need to do in order to take the objectives referenced in the Lambeth mandate, the Lambeth Declaration, and of course from the Pope. These are so important, particularly in these times that we're now in. So I hope you can all see that first slide, which just basically lets you know the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons was very much the strategy and the organization that brought together people from all over the world, from the survivors of nuclear weapons use in Japan and testing around the Pacific and Kazakhstan and, indigenous people in many places in the world, actually, to activists who've worked on nuclear weapons for a long time, but also the activists that have worked on human rights, on getting rid of landmines and cluster munitions, by a humanitarian disarmament treaty process that they developed, and we who were working on nuclear weapons learned from them and then involved with them, because they were the best people to reach out to their governments and say, not only that these weapons must be banned, but that it was the right and responsibility of every government in the world to ban them. And through that, we were mobilizing really greater understanding. Of course, everyone understood on some level that nuclear weapons were immoral and that they could pose an extinction level threat. We, had heard about, well, those of us that were alive then had heard about nuclear winter. I was at Greenham Common, and we talked to people about what nuclear weapons would actually do. But how this treaty came about was bringing that together with the recognition that international humanitarian law actually, and indeed was a multilateral process by which all states could ban and then work together on the elimination of nuclear weapons. And that's really, really important, because previously always nuclear weapons were always seen as something that was really for the countries that actually had the weapons. It was their power, it was their fiefdom. They used it as a status. They vetoed resolutions in the UN Security Council because they saw themselves. They even used a word like nuclear powers. And as we reframed this, and as we reached out to the leaders of all the religions, we were calling these weapons what they really are: nuclear weapons of mass destruction. And we call these states not powers, but nuclear armed states. And we continued to really put that forward and link it with the climate, both the climate data that showed how just a handful of nuclear weapons could cause, not just the deaths of potentially millions of people directly in the cities in which they were used. There were models done on the basis of India and Pakistan, but there were also, to put it in perspective, this was the firing power, if you like, on one nuclear, of the UK's nuclear armed submarines. A handful of the world's arsenals could actually cause nuclear winter through dust clouds from those destroyed cities that would entomb the earth. And on that basis, we said to every government, look, the information from the doctors we work with say 2 billion people will starve, starting in Africa, because they already have food insecurity. Latin America and Africa both, had turned their whole continents into nuclear-free zones. And it was on this basis that the countries took forward the recognition that they actually had to ban nuclear weapons, and they had the right and the responsibility. And on the 24th of October, as we know, the 50th signatory was lodged with the UN. The ratification, rather, was lodged with the UN. There are now 51 states parties and 87 signatories. And the treaty enters into force, as we've heard, on the 22nd of January. So the fundamental part of this treaty is in its preamble that explains the reasons why nuclear weapons have to be banned and eliminated. And I want to draw attention to paragraph 4 from the preamble, because in many ways it kind of encapsulates the fundamental humanitarian imperative. Cognizant that the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons cannot be adequately addressed, transcend national borders, pose grave implications for human survival, the environment, socioeconomic development, the global economy, food security, and the health of current and future generations, and have a disproportionate impact on women and girls, including as a result of ionizing radiation. That's the 4th paragraph in a far-reaching feminist humanitarian disarmament framing preamble to this treaty. And here now come the Article 1 prohibitions, the fundamental prohibitions. If you look at these are the prohibitions that ban the use, even the threat of use, the use, the deployment, the production, the acquisition and proliferation of nuclear weapons, all the activities that could lead anyone, not just states, but this treaty in its text applies also to non-state actors, to prevent anyone from acquiring or using nuclear weapons. These are the practical activities that go to the possibility of acquiring and using nuclear weapons. And then the treaty also calls for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. It builds a safeguard, some of the regime that has been developed through the Non-Proliferation Treaty since 1968, but it builds much more clearly. So it underpins that and makes it very clear in the treaty. But when it looks at the states, the 9 states that have nuclear weapons and the 31 states or other that are involved in nuclear sharing and doctrines and policies based on the use of nuclear weapons, it comes up with 2 kinds of pathways, ways for those states to join the treaty. They can either do the first of these, they can sign first, and then they can negotiate with the states parties and what is called the competent international authority, which the states parties will, from this year, when they start meeting as states parties of this treaty after entry into force, they will start negotiating the detail, putting flesh on the bones of how they are going to implement, to ensure compliance, to verify. But the treaty talks about developing talks about a competent international authority. They have to decide what that should be. And the likelihood is that they will develop that and work with the International Atomic Energy Agency. So this A is about negotiating what needs to be done and a timetable, recognizing one size doesn't fit all. You know, the UK's nuclear arsenal is much smaller than the US and Russia, for example, and therefore the negotiations can mean that the UK on signing can be helped to get rid of the nuclear weapons much more quickly and to be putting our skills into verification and implementation. But there's also a B option, which was called the South African option. It's what South Africa did when it got rid of its own nuclear arsenal at the time of getting rid of apartheid. It actually eliminated the nuclear weapons under its own auspices and then called in the IAEA to verify its declarations, and then it joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And South Africa was one of the leading states in negotiating the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And so part of this also elimination, as I mentioned, is the meetings of states parties. The first is due to be held in Vienna in well, within the year from the 22nd of January. So we're expecting it in November or December. COVID willing, it'll be held in Vienna. Austria has volunteered, and it will determine the rules and institutions, the competent international authority, the verification, the enforcement, and so on. And there are other provisions which I won't spend time on now. So in my last slide, I just want to talk about the implications. This treaty is a legal treaty, but as with all treaties, it will work by persuasion, not by coercion. That it is binding as of the 22nd of January on all its states parties. And through the states parties, through something called national implementation legislation, which is just the legislation that they enact nationally to apply the treaty. Through those, it becomes binding on anyone who is a resident or under the jurisdiction or control, which includes individuals, non-state, also includes companies, and we'll be talking a little bit, well, I know Steve will be talking about why that is so important. It's normative. It really takes away the value, takes away any kind of status attached to hanging on to nuclear weapons. Quite the reverse. The weapons are pariah, and the nuclear armed states that are not trying to get rid of their nuclear weapons become pariah in this situation. The states parties can start now actually putting the flesh on the treaty text, and particularly need to do that in terms of the rules of procedure, the decision making, but compliance, enforcement, verification. And then we, all of us who aren't actually governments, we need to think about what we can do to bring this treaty into force in our own countries. I hope in the discussion I can say a little bit more about cities taking up local authority on the 17th of December, Brighton and Hove, but Manchester, Edinburgh, Paris, and many cities all around the world have been adopting motions to commit to the treaty, to support it, to apply it as best as they can as locally elected officials, to universalize the norms, even as we try to sign up and make universal the states parties. We know that's going to take time. There's such an important job here for faith leaders. And so on that note, I want to thank you so much for inviting me to speak, and hand back to Russell.
Thanks, Rebecca. That's a really helpful overview. We will be sharing Rebecca's presentation with you by email after this session, and we will have plenty of time for questions and answers. If you've got questions already whirring around, please feel free to type them in the chat, and we'll come to those after we've heard from Steve. But as Rebecca just said, one of the key aspects that the treaty covers is the behaviour of companies. So Steve is now going to tell us a bit more about work that's being done with regard to financial institutions and banks. So Steve, over to you. You're muted, Steve, sorry.
Sorry, I thought I'd unmuted myself. Thank you very much, and thanks for Anglican Pacifist Fellowship and CPO for this opportunity to share with you. I'm going to share a screen briefly, and it will only be briefly. I'll bring us back into session again, but this is just to introduce the topic that I'm going to speak to today. Rebecca talked about norms, and we often think about norms in terms of norms between nation states. But what I'm interested to explore here is the norms that we might be able to introduce within the business and finance industry. Just as by way of introduction, as Russell has said, I work for the Joint Public Issues team and policy advisor on international affairs. I work across the Methodist Church, the Baptist Union, the United Reformed Church, and the Church of Scotland, and working frequently with other ecumenical partners as well. The last couple of years, we've been working on a research project as Faiths Together. Let me get this going. That's better. And we call ourselves the Nuclear Weapons Financing Research Group. And it comprises of the 4 JPIT partners, plus Pax Christi, Quakers, SGI, which is a Buddhist group, Christian CND, and a number of other faith-based partners. But we're offering this research not just to the faith community, but to the wider community in the UK. We spent 1 year doing research and report writing. We've identified the 15 largest institutional investors in the UK. These are banks and pension funds. And we wrote with and engaged with each of them over a period of a number of months. We wanted to find out what is their approach to investments in companies that produce or maintain nuclear weapons. What are their policies? What's the extent of their exposure in these companies? What are the opportunities for us to achieve change? And I'm going to, in this brief presentation, cover 3 specific areas. First of all, what is the investment practice of our churches? It makes good sense to check out what we are doing ourselves first. Secondly, what is the wider approach of the investment industry to avoidance of certain sectors or stocks? And thirdly, how can people bring about change specifically with... Let me bring us back into session again. And start off with the first of those areas. What is the practice in our churches with regard to our own investment in nuclear weapons? It seemed important to us that before we undertook this exercise, we established first whether our own houses are in order. In brief, the answer is that with respect to our own institutional investments and our pension funds which come under our own trusteeship, that we are not significantly exposed to companies involved with nuclear weapons. I won't say that there is never any exposure, but on the whole, the risk is very low. The 2 denominations of the Church of England and the Methodist Church have their own investment operations in the City of London. This places them in a slightly different position to most others. These 2 have long had blanket exclusions on investment in companies with an involvement in nuclear weapons. This is in contrast to see Church of England or Methodist policy on other forms of investment around conventional weapons or other military involvement, where in those cases there is a threshold percentage which is applied. With the case of nuclear weapons, our threshold percentage is effectively 0%. The practice of our churches also contrasts sharply with the general practice across the wider investment management industry to date. So this brings us then to our second area that I'm going to cover with you, and that is, what is the practice in the wider investment industry with regard to investment in production or maintenance of nuclear weapons? Estimates suggest that private investors globally control some $120 trillion of assets. That's across all of the sectors globally. This figure is so large, it's even difficult to imagine what $120 trillion actually means. What we're looking to do with this project is effectively to build a new norm within the finance industry with respect to nuclear weapons. Let's bear in mind that this massive industry does have some political influence. So what is the investment industry practice with regarding screening out of investments in sectors that might cause environmental, social damage or have governance concerns? These are what are typically known as ESG concerns. The sectors that we might be thinking about here would be things like tobacco, gambling, mining, environmental concerns, oil, gas and coal, and military hardware. And the answer is that in general, the industry does not use screening to exclude companies or sectors. ESG concerns are taken forward through investment and engagement. When an avoidance strategy is used, it tends to be limited to a few niche ethical investment funds managed by the investment management company, while that bank or financial institution as a whole restricts such restrictions on investment across the bulk of their business. So they allow avoidance strategy to be applied to a small proportion of their funds. They are against avoidance across the whole of their business. However, there's been one notable exception to date, an exception in one particular sector, and that is with respect to controversial weapons. A common definition here are weapons that are indiscriminate in their effect and are banned by international treaty. Controversial weapons include landmines, cluster munitions, chemical and biological weapons. Only a small minority of investors to date have included nuclear weapons in this category. However, with the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, now we see nuclear weapons come within these same criteria as other forms of weapons. We can now consider nuclear weapons in that category. When we have a dialogue with major banks and investment institutions on this subject, they tend to recognize the force of this logic. If you have a practice that bans investment in any company involved in the production of weapons that are indiscriminate in their effect and are banned by international treaty, then how can you not extend that policy to nuclear weapons, irrespective of the position of your own government, if you happen to be, for example, a bank listed in the UK? So we do have the very real possibility of the introduction of a new norm across the industry, an industry that controls vast sums of money. But in our discussions with companies, it's also been clear that there is resistance to change. While there is resistance, there is some positive signs. For example, People's Pension, which is one of the largest pension providers in the UK, during our discussions with them, they promised to include nuclear weapons as an issue in a survey of their members to determine their members' interests and concerns. Pension funds and banks are very influenced by what they hear from their members and their customers. And this brings me on to my third section, and that is, what can we do? It's really important that banks and pension funds hear from their members on this. And I think that possibly for many Christians today, the issue of nuclear weapons may seem a bit remote, maybe, or too vast for some people to engage with. But might people feel that by identifying the issue with their savings or their pension funds, it offers one practical way in which they can make a difference? Our group, the UK Nuclear Weapons Financing Research Group, has produced a comprehensive report on the state of play in the UK finance industry. We've also produced a tool that makes it very easy for people to take action. So on our website, investinginchange.uk, there is a take action section that links you to a template letter. In fact, there are 15 template letters, each one tailored to each of the 15 institutions within our survey. If you write the letter, you may find that the company responds initially by stating that they have ethical funds or ethical pension funds that can avoid investment in nuclear weapons. As I've discussed, that for us is not the issue. For us, the issue now becomes compliance with an international treaty, and we expect that compliance to apply across the whole of an institution's business. So there's a process of dialogue that we have to have here with our banks and pension funds. I also think it's quite achievable to get this movement within the industry. If you compare this, for example, with the other area of disinvestment, which is very much current and in play at the moment, and that is disinvestment around fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are a massive part of the investment sector. They represent a very significant part of the FTSE 100. In comparison, the global survey Don't Bank on the Bomb has identified only 27 companies that are very significantly involved in the production or maintenance of nuclear weapons. So disinvestment from nuclear weapons is much more achievable than disinvestment for fossil fuels, which banks and pension funds are also needing to deal with at this moment. So in summary, from my perspective, our efforts in this area are not just about removing money from private sector money from the production and maintenance of nuclear weapons, as valuable as that objective may be in itself. It's also about building a new norm on nuclear weapons across the whole of the finance and business sector, at the same time as we work in other ways to build a new norm between nations. Join us in this, write to your banks and pension funds, and be really happy to talk about that, this whole area further in questions. I'll leave it there and hand back to Russell.